Kieran, great to have you here. And Wes, I understand you are going to be the wing person for Kieran.
I am.
Wonderful. Kieran, you're going to talk about RIST and what we've learned. Thank you so much for agreeing to present. We're glad to have you, and take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot, Brad and Wes. It's great to be speaking at VidTrans. Video transport is literally probably the hottest topic right now in all of broadcasting for all sorts of reasons. So it's great to be probably the only conference about this. Thanks, whoever that was. So yes, I'll be talking about RIST and 2 years of RIST around the world and what we have learned. So quick sort of company introduction. Who are we? We're a company specializing in software-based encoders and decoders for sport, news, and channel contribution. It's B2B based, unsurprisingly, at VidTrans. Normally be based in central London, so I could just point over there and see Big Ben in the distance, but alas, not this time. We build everything in-house, hardware, firmware, software, so we have kind of a unique understanding of how all of these standards and specifications work. So last year we talked about writing a 2110 stack in software from scratch. This year it's about deploying RIST again from scratch. It's worth saying we're not to be confused with the other OBS, Open Broadcaster software. So what are the problems that RIST solves? And really in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a big push to use unmanaged connectivity for B2B video transport. Unmanaged connectivity usually is the public internet, but it could also be something like long distance wireless links over 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz spectrum that's unmanaged, it's unlicensed. And this has been driven by, of course, increased growth of good quality internet access. There are clearly commercial drivers in the industry through management and accountants to reduce costs. And there are also now end users in the B2B space who are OTT online platforms and internet native, so they just can't ingest content via traditional means like satellite or private fiber. And what people have done in the past is use things like forward error correction, but this isn't really designed for unmanaged networks. In particular, burst loss is limited by the size of the FEC matrix that you're using. And there are quite a few interoperability issues with the way the matrices are designed. And so what happened is there was a growth of proprietary solutions to perform error recovery. A few examples on the right-hand side there, all of which are very good in their own particular way. But this had the unfortunate effect that it created incompatible islands in many facilities. And then later on, this thing called the cloud came along. Inherently, it's a lossy place, and you have to use unmanaged connectivity in the main to get there. I'll talk a bit more about that later. So where did we start as a company? Like I said, we used FEC for many years, and for many use cases, it's still good enough. Certainly within small countries over short distances, it's tolerable enough to be used still. And so the first thing we did was, before RIST existed, was implement RFC 4585. This is the IETF standard for retransmission. So if there's a lost packet, retransmission is requested. Zoom is almost certainly using something very similar, if not exactly that, for example. But then in 2018, RIST Simple Profile was released. And so we subsequently implemented RIST Simple Profile. This was basically a set of minor differences in practice. And we put RIST on air in early 2019 and had quite a fast feedback process. So I'm sure there are some great network emulators out there, but unfortunately nothing beats the real world. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So here's an example. It's a little bit out of date, but this map kind of shows the kind of places where we have deployed RIST. There's a lot more of it now, probably, or from our point of view, 60 to 100 sites. But it's worth pointing out there's things in India, China, Africa, Middle East, not just sort of traditional West, where ISPs and network providers are doing all sorts of interesting things to the traffic. And so we're kind of doing it for real and for all sorts of different applications. 24/7 linear channels to satellite uplink. It's worth pointing out, satellite is great, it has a huge footprint, but you still have to get your channel to the satellite uplink cost effectively. And so RIST is one of the mechanisms for doing that. Interactive two-way talking heads for news is pretty common. There's obviously been a lot of news in the past year, elections, etc. So this is a very common use case for RIST. Live events, it's common now to have pretty good connectivity on site for live events. RIST is still a way that content can be delivered from a live event to wherever it needs to get to. Long form studio programming often as a primary path to air. Again, there are places in the world where connectivity via traditional means isn't as easy. So using more generic connectivity methods is a better way of doing it. Reverse vision lines, so monitoring, in particular nowadays in people's homes. This is another use case for RIST. And so we do have, probably fair to say, millions of viewers daily watching RIST content. Why did we go RIST? Really the key driver of this was having dual connection support from day one. ISPs alone do have their own individual issues, but being able to have dual connections is a way of mitigating that. And it's worth pointing out other protocols such as SRT claim to support dual connections, but actually what they do is set up two independent connections that know nothing about each other. And so the RIST approach is superior because both connections do know about each other, so that retransmissions can be made on both links, and this allows for maximum error recovery potential. So the example on the right is a good example. This was a 9-month transmission between London and New York over 2 ISPs. I think 91 billion packets. But over that time, each ISP did have issues, but overall, not a single packet was lost in those 9 months because of the fact that there was resilience.
Hey, Kieran, do you have any feeling for whether those were intermittent packet losses or bursts, or
all sorts, both. Sometimes minute-long outages of that order of magnitude.
Yeah.
But there are two sort of, I think okay, somebody's answered the question in there, it's written both as well. But the point being that there is quote unquote salt and pepper noise. There's also just random noise that happens. It has a sort of traditional distribution. There's burst loss, and there's just outages completely where the service will go down for a month.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, a month, a minute, sorry.
Well, they do go down for months too, don't they?
They do go down for a month too sometimes. Yeah, well, in Texas maybe. So it's worth thinking a bit about RIST site design. Often RIST end users are co-locating equipment at a third party using an unmanaged connection of some sort. And this is often competing with existing IT traffic. Sometimes that IT traffic could actually be much larger than the broadcast traffic these days if it's going to another site and people are doing their Asperas and Signiants, etc. So it's worth thinking about this. It's also worth thinking about how to manage equipment remotely. In our case, we use firewalls and VPNs to access IPMI, Intelligent Platform Management Interface. So this is the ability to access out-of-band equipment out of band, to do remote reboots, remote monitoring. This is particularly more important today. There's nobody technical on site often. It's often a skeleton staff. You can often be asking people who don't really understand technology to start unplugging things, and that's a dangerous game. So it's really important to have some form of mechanism to be able to access IPMI. And in our cases, the firewall and VPN handles the encryption side of things, control and video. It's also important to think a little bit about security. You're often receiving or handing off feeds from or to third parties. It's often important to think a bit about firewalling and how you're going to make sure that they can't send to you or you can't send to them. And some of the other interesting things about RIST is there's already native support in existing tools such as TCP dump and Wireshark. So the screenshot above is a real RIST session. And this makes it possible to go and fault find very quickly. It's actually even possible for end users, such as in this example, to fault find issues in third-party implementations and get them fixed. These are very standard protocols, and they're relatively straightforward to understand. There's not too much complexity going on in them. There is, of course, a 3-letter elephant in the room, and I've written extensively about the technical merits of RIST versus SRT, and if you want more information, you can email me or contact me afterwards. But I'd like to talk about more about what the SRT Alliance is doing and the things RIST can learn from them. In particular, they have a very active community on Slack. It's very easy for developers to get started with the SRT library. They can get their questions answered very quickly. The RIST one is much quieter. They provide a relatively mature library in the form of libsrt. It's pretty easy to integrate, and so they have a very wide product base compared to RIST. And in the end, it's much easier to get started both as an end user or a manufacturer with SRT than it is with RIST. And so here's my pitch. We need increased support for librist, the library Sergio just presented. For the majority of the world, librist is RIST. And I would like to compare this with something like PDF. PDF is ISO, whatever the number is. But for all of us, it's actually the process of creating and sharing PDF files. We don't really care about the documents per se. librist is the de facto library for ingesting cloud streams. Yet there's pretty limited interoperability testing between vendors. And so we need increased support from the RIST community in making librist better. Ourselves in our company, we've personally spent the last 6 months probably doing weekly testing. The librist team are very, very responsive and have fixed a lot of issues as a result. But this 6 months should have been a 1 month job. We need more vendors to get involved. We've also sponsored librist support in FFmpeg. FFmpeg pretty much a de facto cloud processing solution at this point for media. So it's really important that that can ingest RIST streams. But in the end, without support for librist, we're currently limiting the growth of the cloud ecosystem for RIST. And it's really important that vendors get involved because the cloud is important and will only continue to get more important. A rising tide really will lift all ships. So what can you do to help improve librist? There are many, many things. Doing regular long-term tests, say every other week, to and from other RIST implementations. This is pretty important. There's a lot of different things out there, and the librist team are very quick, very within minutes sometimes to go and actually resolve any problems. They can write documentation, white papers, write more about the use cases. Hey, this is how I set up librist in AWS and got started in setting up RIST streams. And really, this is as important, if not more important, than producing documents such as the VSFTRs. It's also quite important that we think a little bit about non-broadcast uses of RIST. In particular, the web streaming industry, they're really in desperate need for a reliable UDP protocol. They need to support something superior to RTMP that uses TCP. And they're also looking for things such as failover and bonding between a wired and 4G internet connection. This is something I'm literally suffering from right now since there's a huge storm outside, and it could be that my internet connection drops during this presentation. And if I'm a streamer, I would love to have a protocol that could flip me between the cell phone I have next to me that's got a comparable internet connection to the wired link, but this just isn't apparent. This just isn't possible at the moment. But the web industry, the web streaming industry, it doesn't have a sort of circuit-based architecture where I'm going to fire a stream to this port number and someone is going to go and manually turn it on. They have hundreds of thousands or millions of streams out there, and they'll need something a bit more advanced to be able to do what they're doing. And they also have non-technical users who aren't going to understand the subtleties of various things, of certificates versus pre-shared keys versus this versus that. They just want it to work. I'm not going to go into all the details because I think Phil Clough from Mux in Malha video gave a very good explanation of all the challenges, but here's an example of one of his slides. He talks about the way that you can route end users based off the stream keys that they have with RTMP, and there isn't really a good way of doing this in SRT and RIST, probably because it's more circuit driven, but you can read this presentation and find out a bit more about that as well. So conclusions, RIST has provided a very high quality solution for professional video transport over the last 2 years, in particular across using multiple ISPs. I've used the example of 2, but it could be more than 2. But the RIST community is relatively small, and the only way it can get bigger and more cloud-centric is by increasing support of the LibRIST project, because it already is the de facto cloud ingest and egress solution. And this will lead to a wider ecosystem. There's also more thought needed about how non-technical end users without sort of circuit switched up infrastructure can benefit from RIST. So it's great that people like Twitch are getting involved in the RIST community. And that's it. If you want to send me an email, you can send me an email there, or well, visit the booth if it's working.
Excellent.
Right. So we've had some great questions popping up in the chat window. I know you've been doing a lot of talking, Kieran. So if you want to give those a quick scan.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I just want to emphasize that is really a core message of your presentation here is that you see LibRIST as the ultimate on-ramp to the cloud for broadcast quality video. In other words, as I understand it, some of the investigation you've done, some of the conversations you've had really say that people want a very strong, reliable, easy to use library that they can bake into their cloud applications. And if RIST matures to that standpoint, LibRIST matures to that standpoint, you think there'll be a lot of people that will adopt RIST. Is that, am I summarizing that correctly?
Yeah, I'm saying in the cloud, people expect the tooling to already be there. And so if they can spin up a VM in EC2 or in Google Cloud and just be able to type sudo pip install or whatever you type in to get LibRIST and have LibRIST work quickly, it will be the de facto solution for the cloud, because things move very quickly in the cloud world. And so that's really what we want to try and get with LibRIST, and also to have that in their cloud workflows and also sometimes on-prem workflows. Yeah.
Yep. So how about somebody like me? I mean, I haven't written a line of code, and I was totting it up there probably about 35 years. So I'm not qualified to do anything. In fact, you'd probably want to rip out any code that I tried to write on LibRIST. But
I'm sure it's not that bad, but okay.
What can somebody like me do to support the effort, and what can other folks here that are interested but maybe not super technical coders do to support the LibRIST effort?
So if you go to the LibRIST website, try and download it, get it to work. If you can't, if you are having trouble, talk to the LibRIST team, document your issues, because there might be something they haven't thought of, some edge case, some new platform. There's a lot of people who have expertise in some of the ecosystems, like the Google ecosystem for Android, the Apple ecosystem. There's the Microsoft .NET ecosystem. People have expertise in that area that maybe the RIST group, the RIST sort of community doesn't have, where you need to, there may be specialist documentation to get things like LibRIST working. And so just because you don't have sort of low-level code expertise doesn't suddenly mean that you can't help. And there's also white papers, documentation. It's always useful, people writing documentations, to see things from a different perspective.
And what can the RIST specification team within the Video Services Forum do specifically to address applications like Twitch and other highly scalable stream delivery systems? What can they do to the spec to make that better, or what new initiatives need to take place?
I think trying to get people more involved. I know they have a very smart engineer from Twitch involved, but I believe they're the only one at the moment. And it's the RIST technology inherently is superior because it supports the failover between 4G and wired. There are no other real protocols doing that, and it is literally something the streaming industry, the streamers are begging for. So trying to think about their world that isn't necessarily as circuit switched, where there's a lot less human intervention. It's not sort of port based. It's not I'm sending to your port, etc. That sort of work. But in the end, these streaming services will use LibRIST. I know Twitch have been investigating LibRIST in depth, so it does go back to the same point. These guys will take librist and spin up a million instances of librist without major issues. So it will need to be rock solid.
So one of the questions from the audience, when IT traffic is competing, and this is Jiangrong Chen, if you want to unmute, go ahead. Otherwise, I'll read it for you.
The question is about, your colleague kind of answered it before, is one of the key design objectives of TCP is fairness, trying to, make the share of bandwidth fairly among all the applications. You also mentioned is in your design objective, you have to take into account is like the broadcast traffic sometimes has to compete with other IT traffic. So is the objective to use FEC or some other mechanism like a very fast retransmission to trying to beat the traffic? Because sometimes the packet loss actually an indication of network congestion.
Sure. So RIST has quite a few mechanisms in place for congestion control, and I won't try and repeat what Sergio said because he did a much better job than I did. But in the end, when it comes down to it, things like TCP are designed that like your kids and the Zoom call and everyone else can have a fair share of bandwidth, whereas RIST is about broadcast critical traffic that needs to be delivered. So in many cases, we do things that are unfair to get traffic to where it needs to be. And I don't think any of the, I speak for myself, but I don't think any of the RIST members would disagree. Is like RIST traffic is, I've written a presentation called RIST for the content that matters, because RIST will try very hard to the extent of sometimes to the detriment sometimes of other applications. Sure, I don't deny that, but it is for broadcast critical traffic. And so RIST will make efforts beyond what traditional TCP will make, for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Great. And I just wanted to point out that there's a comment in the forum, I'm sorry, in the chat window from Ciro talking about the RIST forum. And if you don't know who that is, the RIST forum is an industry marketing organization. It's separate from the Video Services Forum, but Kieran and myself and many of the other folks that you've seen talking about RIST are members of the RIST forum. And this spring, we're planning to have a RIST test week where we're going to do exactly what Kieran indicated, which is get a bunch of people to put up a bunch of streams and try to do some, long-term testing, maybe not 9 months, Kieran, but maybe overnight, things like that. And, just try to, rattle the cage, see what we can break and see what works. There's one other question from Chris Chinnock. Chris, did you want to unmute and ask that?
Yeah, hi, I'm with the 8K Association. So we're interested in trying to understand how RIST can help solve some of the distribution challenges for 8K.
Sure, I think there's a presentation about that tomorrow, I believe, as well. But in the end, for the reasons I kind of talked about at the beginning, there will still be needs to get B2B content around the world. And in particular, for something like 8K, it's probably fair to say B2B transmission of things like 8K will be over. There'll be commercial challenges about, taking up a whole satellite transponder just for 1 or 2 8K channels. So it may be fair to say that 8K video will be, at least on a B2B standpoint, be distributed over more cost-effective methods using a protocol such as RIST.
Might it be worth considering adding some 8K content to your interrupt test this spring?
If we have anybody who can display it, yes.
Yeah.
But sure, Chris, we'd love to have you have anybody, join in.
All right, let's talk about that offline.
Great. All right, we've hit our time window. So Brad, are you coming back on?
I am. Great job. Kieran, thank you so much. Wes,
thanks.
appreciate you serving as a wing person there. That's great.